Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, managing editor of Shadowproof, joined by my colleague Brian Sonnenstein, and it's good to be with you for another edition of the Dissenter Weekly. It's June 3rd, 2021. I'm in a new apartment, so I'm figuring out all the kinks. I don't think my video and audio is going to be that great. Might be a little patchy at times, but we will hang with it. Actually, I'm getting a notification that my service has, just as we started, cratered. So I don't know what exactly to do about that because it was fine before we started. But that's the way it goes when you're doing low budget streaming at an independent media organization. So I seem to have a little bit of a connection. I think you all can hear me. We will power through. We only have a few stories. I'm keeping this brief again as we have this new setup. I'm figuring out how things would work. But let's have Brian give you the few housekeeping items we have for you, and then we'll get to the stories.
Perfect. Thanks, Kevin. I mean, so far, so good. Let's everybody watching, keep your fingers crossed and see if we can get through this with a good connection. Just a quick reminder that wherever you're watching us today, to make sure that you're following or liking or whatever the word is for wherever you are right now. And if you want to support the show, Shadowproof and the work that Kevin does, everything is 100% reader supported. We don't have any big donors or funders or grant money or anything like that. We operate off of small donations from people like you. So if you like the show, you can go to shadowproof.com/donate. We will have some information on Kevin's newsletter, which you can also subscribe to and support to fund our reporting. But yeah, let's dive into some of the stories we have this week, Kevin. First up here, we have New York Times reporters had phone records secretly seized by the Justice Department. Why don't you walk us through this one?
Yeah, and I understand that for many of you who share our contempt for how the establishment media often doesn't cover critical stories, you may not have a lot of sympathy for what these reporters are going through, but I do think it's important to maintain some consistency here and to say that no matter what, we do not approve of the Justice Department targeting any journalists' phone records, whether they be journalists like the ones we're going to talk about in this particular instance, or whether they be journalists like Julian Assange or journalists like us who are independent and maybe working even on a smaller scale, that we do not want to be targets of the Justice Department during any presidential administration. So from the New York Times, we have a story which is actually another in a line of stories that confirmed that the Trump Justice Department secretly seized the phone records of 4 New York Times reporters spanning nearly 4 months in 2017 as part of a leak investigation. So these are really alarming to me, and they fit into our coverage of whistleblowers and leaks because primarily they were to launch an investigation into finding sources, media sources, so that the Justice Department could potentially charge them under laws and criminally prosecute them. And we know that they would have chosen to prosecute these sources with the Espionage Act, which has been their favorite law to use, whether we're talking about the Trump administration or President Barack Obama's administration. This is now the law of choice for the Justice Department. So these revelations come after notices to reporters at the Washington Post, as well as a CNN reporter, that phone and email logs were seized from those reporters. And so Bruce D. Brown, the executive director of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, he put out a statement for the organization that said very plainly, President Biden said recently, the seizure of reporters' phone records is simply wrong. And it is. For his Justice Department, this is a crucial early test of its stated commitment to press freedom and transparency. It's urgent that we hear from the Attorney General about all 3 Trump-era records seizures, including the purported reasoning behind them and the rationale for not notifying the journalists in advance. The goal must be to ensure that such abuses never occur again. And so for those of you unaware, there's a history and a bit of a continuity here between the Trump administration and the Obama administration when it comes to the seizure of phone records. The journalists we're going to name who had their records seized from the New York Times had actually been targeted before. Two of them, at least, had been targeted before by prior administrations. And so now what we need to know from the Biden Justice Department is what kind of assurances Merrick Garland is going to give. There were media guidelines that were supposedly hammered out between Eric Holder and journalists after a scandal erupted in 2012 around the Associated Press having their records seized. And they had about 100 phone lines in their offices impacted by a leaked prosecution that was launched. And the New York Times recounts it. It goes back over some of this history and mentions that two of the reporters targeted, Matt Apuzzo and Adam Goldman back then, they were then working for the Associated Press and broke news about a bomb plot by an al-Qaeda affiliate in Yemen. And they were notified that the Obama Justice Department secretly subpoenaed 2 months of their phone records, along with those of other reporters and editors. So that was to further that leak prosecution. And then now, in this case, we're talking about 4 reporters who were targeted. And those individuals who were targeted are Matt Apuzzo and Adam Goldman, Eric Leaksblau, and Michael S. Schmidt were 4 Times reporters. And it's believed they were working on a story that involved James Comey, then FBI director, who was handling the investigation into Hillary Clinton and whether she abused her private email server, or the way she used her private email server. Did she commit a crime? He was looking into that case. And so now I need to mention that in the reporting of what has happened to their reporters, the New York Times is also doing a bit of intelligence laundering. And I don't really want to let them off the hook for it. I noticed that in their report, they mentioned that the story in which they reported that led to their reporters being targeted, it covered a memo or email that was written by a Democratic operative who expressed confidence that the Attorney General at the time, Loretta Lynch, would keep the Clinton investigation from going too far. So I'm reading from the New York Times coverage of this, and they conclude with this sentence: Russian hackers had obtained the document, but it is apparently not among those that Russia sent to WikiLeaks, intelligence officials concluded. I just think it's important to remind everyone that we do not have a whole lot of confirmation about what Russian intelligence connected people or anyone did as far as providing any information to WikiLeaks. And Julian Assange himself has maintained that Russia was not the source of any of the information that was disclosed. And to this day, I do not think that even the New York Times or Washington Post or any of these targeted outlets have ever managed to poke holes in the assertions of Julian Assange or anyone at WikiLeaks when they have made these stated claims about their sources. And so this is, this is unfortunate. They're being targeted by intelligence officials for leak prosecutions, and at the same time, they're laundering intelligence for these officials. Again, it's an old recycled bit of suggesting that WikiLeaks was given information by the Russians, but still, it's upsetting that this is continuing at the same time that they themselves are targets. So there's a thumbnail history in this article, and Leaksblau was targeted for coverage of the warrantless wiretapping program under George W. Bush. And then it's also worth reminding everyone that after the AP scandal, there was another somewhat less of a scandal, but still critical episode where there was a leak investigation revealed about a Fox News article on North Korea's nuclear program. This was the article that the source was, I believe, Stephen Kim. He ended up pleading guilty. He was prosecuted under the Espionage Act. This involved James Rosen, who they characterized as a aider, abettor, and co-conspirator of a leak, which produced outrage and was partly why Eric Holder sat down and tried to hammer out some kind of guidelines with media about notifying journalists with subpoena when they were to be subpoenaed, giving media some kind of information so that they could protect themselves and their confidential sources. And so again, now I think when Biden says things like simply this is wrong, it shouldn't happen, there's a bit of hubris there, or I suppose there's a bit of ignorance too, where he's not acknowledging that the Obama administration had this problem, and he gets to enjoy the luxury of people thinking this is just a Trump issue. But it's important to recognize that the Justice Department seizes reporters' records regularly with these leaked prosecutions, and now it's going to be up to the Justice Department to do something to change this, or to actually convince reporters that it's not going to happen again, because I don't think there are very many safeguards in place to prevent it from happening.
Thanks, Kevin. That's a great overview and analysis right there. I really appreciate that. Let's go to our next story here. We have Inspector General in Florida grants COVID-19 data scientist whistleblower status. What is this story?
So first, let me say that I acknowledge there is controversy over this individual, and there are some things that she's alleged to have done that people think should disqualify her as a whistleblower. I may get around to digging deeper. The National Review did an article that methodically went through some of her actions and suggested that this made it clear that she was not a whistleblower. So I find it really important, though, as a counter to some of this media coverage, that the Inspector General's office of Florida has now gone and granted her whistleblower status under the Florida law. She was involved in working on the COVID-19 data dashboard for the Florida Department of Health. She was fired. She's claimed that there was misleading data or even false data that was being presented to the public by Governor Ron DeSantis's state government. And there's been coverage of the way Florida handled the pandemic that has suggested or made it seem that it could be plausible that Florida wanted to do something with the numbers so that it looked like the spread of the virus was not as severe. They did want to have far more things open last year in 2020 than many other states. So the Miami Herald reports that last week, the Office of Inspector General informed Rebecca Jones that the information she disclosed did meet the criteria for whistleblower status as described by Florida statutes. This was an email that the Miami Herald reported on, and there's a letter from the Inspector General. His name is Michael J. Bennett, who says that her complaint demonstrates, quote, reasonable cause to suspect that an employee or agent of an agency or independent contractor has violated a federal, state, or local law, rule, or regulation. And I think that, this is a unfolding story. I don't want to state any conclusions about what she did or did not do, because I haven't done close digging beyond my very surface coverage that we've done here on this show, saying like when she was arrested, we reported on that. When she came forward with her claims, we reported on that. When she lost her job and all of this, we've been following this like a lot of other media, just covering it as things take place. We'll see if she's able to defend herself and use this whistleblower status to prevent prosecution from going forward. She is charged with crimes in Florida. I don't know how this whistleblower status will insulate her from being prosecuted for doing those, committing those alleged offenses. I'll reserve my judgment for her, and I'll just say that I am reluctant to kill the messenger. It's often the case that in whistleblower cases, people put the whistleblower under the microscope, they look at their flaws, you'll hear things about how they were involved in domestic abuse, or they have drug problems, or they have an addiction issue, or they have mental health issues. And really none of that matters, because the Inspector General's office, who is usually a neutral arbiter, if they're validating the whistleblower claim and suggesting there's some merit and that we should investigate it further, then I think we have to give her the benefit of the doubt until the Inspector General invalidates the allegations. So I'd say let the process unfold. Let's see what happens. I'm not willing to join the pile-on against Rebecca Jones at the moment, despite some of the things that she's said and done that might lead me to doubt her.
Thank you, Kevin, for that as well, and for keeping on that story. Next up, Dan Ellsberg risks prosecution, exposes secret nuclear war documents. What do you have here?
So this is from last week. We didn't have a show because of the Memorial Day weekend, but this broke, and Dan is now 90 years old, and I think we can all give him a lot of admiration and respect, because he hasn't slowed down when it comes to rebelling against the military-industrial complex. He had a document that he took with him along with the Pentagon Papers, and we know all the widespread impact he had as the Pentagon Papers whistleblower, revealing this 50 years ago and challenging the Vietnam War, and the prosecution he endured, and how he's become this kind of, I don't know, I don't want to make him too much, I don't want to deify him too much, but he's kind of a saintly figure. Anybody who's a whistleblower who comes forward, usually Dan Ellsberg is going to speak up in support of you and give you some public backing so that you can have some ability to fight back against the US government as they target you. And he has a study that he shared with the New York Times, dozens of pages from this classified 1966 study that exposed that US military leaders pushed for a first-use nuclear strike on China, accepting the risk that the Soviet Union would retaliate in kind on behalf of its ally, and millions of people would die. This is from the New York Times' write-up on these declassified documents. He brought this to the attention of the Times because the study was censored by the US government. This particular issue, which involved a Taiwan Strait crisis that was occurring, this information was kept from the public despite the disclosure of the study, the extent to which there was a push for potentially starting a nuclear war. The pages of this document feature the attitude of General Lawrence S. Cooter, the top Air Force commander for the Pacific, according to the Times. He wanted authorization for a first-use nuclear attack on mainland China at the start of any armed conflict. To that end, he praised a plan that would start by dropping atomic bombs on Chinese airfields, but not other targets, arguing that its relative restraint would make it harder for skeptics of nuclear warfare in the American government to block the plan. So this general was aware that there was opposition to escalating into a nuclear war, and he wanted to pursue or consider the pursuit of actions that might put us on a brink where we could not pull back. And Dan Ellsberg has written a book, in addition to his memoir on being the Pentagon Papers whistleblower. He did a book going through the history of his involvement in studying nuclear first use policy and nuclear weapons policy in the US. It's called The Doomsday Machine. I highly recommend this book. Highly recommend listening to his interviews, several of the interviews he's done about this topic. I interviewed him on this topic for unauthorized disclosure. So it's very compelling what he has to say about all of this and the way in which the US has used nuclear weapons before. We are using nuclear weapons when we threaten other countries, because they know that if they don't do what we say, then there's a possibility that we might fire those nuclear weapons. So that's what makes them a valid deterrent. The fact that as you make the threat, that there's a belief that you could back up that threat. And so just because you don't launch them doesn't mean you aren't making the world less safe with nuclear weapons. And this is what Daniel Ellsberg has been covering very closely. And so now the added thing that needs to be said is the coverage of the story by the New York Times mentioned he wants this to be an Espionage Act test case, and he is daring the Justice Department to bring charge against him and have him go before court and defend his right to expose this document and reveal this information. This is from a document in 1966, so it is over 50 years old. It should not be classified anymore, and yet clearly our government still thinks it has some part to play in causing tensions between China and the United States. I mean, China's not going to like knowing that we considered using nuclear weapons against anything than which they had laid claim over. And so that is why it remains secret. And that should not be a justification to keep U.S. plans for nuclear war from the public, especially historic plans. And Dan Ellsberg will tell you the reason why he's disclosing this is because he's seen tensions ramping up between the United States and China. And he does not want us to end up in a moment where we are on the brink of nuclear war. And so now we have this information. We also have the open question of whether the Justice Department is going to be consistent, go after someone like Daniel Ellsberg, who did the thing that they've been targeting lower level people, less visible people for doing, or are they going to completely ignore him because they're afraid that if he went to court, then he would win, and it would make it harder for them to bring the Espionage Act against media sources and whistleblowers, people who expose information in the public interest. And I think we probably all know the answer. We know what Joe Biden's administration is going to do. It's a 90-year-old hero, someone who's had a lot of impact and inspired people. But I admire the courage, the risk-taking, and knowing that this could be the last thing that you do in your life. I mean, he wouldn't want to be prosecuted and seriously be sentenced to 1 or 2 years. That could mean that he spent the last years of his life in a prison cell, and he doesn't have to do this, but he's taking the risk because he believes that the Espionage Act is wrong, and that this is a valid example that could go before a judge or a jury and help invalidate the way the Espionage Act is employed by the Justice Department. So we've got two things going on here. We've got an opportunity, if the Justice Department takes the bait, to meaningfully challenge the Espionage Act. But then two, we've got this information about the potential nuclear war that nearly occurred back in the 1960s.
Thank you, Kevin. Let's move on to our next story here. We have an anniversary of NSA whistleblower reality winner's arrest. Talk to us about this.
Yeah, and again, thanks for hanging with me. Apologize for any of the hiccups with the audio or video throughout in a new location. And it might take a couple of weeks to get everything working smoothly and seamlessly as we do the broadcasts. But I'm glad for those who are tuning in, and a thank you for tuning in. And we'll get to concluding the show here with this story is to just mark the anniversary of NSA whistleblower reality winner's arrest. It is June 3rd, and it's been back in I believe it was 2017 that she was arrested, and she's been in prison since and been demanding that Joe Biden release her, show some form of clemency to her because of the fact that she doesn't deserve to be in prison for what she did. She believed that she was exposing a document that was in the public interest, part of the conversation over whether the Trump administration had committed election interference and done so with support, or perhaps Russia was involved separately and the Trump administration had nothing to do with it. Whatever the case may be, Trump was going around saying none of this had happened, and she thought she had a document that contradicted what Trump was saying. And so for doing that, she ended up being punished by the Trump Justice Department and became their first case, the first leaker, the first whistleblower who was put in prison. And we hope that she will be free very, very soon. And I think there are people all over that are standing with her today. Her mom was asking supporters to change their profile pictures to indicate that they stand with Reality Winner. There are people who are very committed supporters of her, and hopefully she won't be in prison at Federal Medical Center Carswell much longer.
Thanks, Kev. The connection's improved a little bit. Did you want to talk about Julian Assange's family in this next piece, or do you want to wrap it there for today?
Yeah. No, I still wanted to cover everything, so we'll get this in quickly while we have some decent internet. The family of Julian Assange, Gabriel Shipton, and John Shipton are coming to the United States, and they'll be making stops in several cities. I believe they're starting in Miami on June 6th, if I have that correct. And they're going to be making a stop in Chicago, where I'm based. I do expect to have some opportunity to connect with them and maybe do some speaking about what is ongoing and educate some people in Chicago about the case against Julian Assange and why the charges should be dropped. And so they're going to be in several cities making multiple stops. I believe in DC, they're going to do a couple stops in order to interact with people who need to be educated about the Julian Assange case. And this is going to be an effort to energize that activism that we've seen city by city on some of the days. We know when he had the anniversary of being in Belmarsh high security prison, of being arrested, that there were dozens of cities in the US and around the world that came out in support of Julian Assange, demanding that the Justice Department drop charges against him. So throw that out as an update on his case. We still do not know when the appeal is going to be heard or if it will be heard by the High Court of Justice, but this is the next thing that is happening in order to try and free Julian Assange.
Great. And why don't you round us out here and tell us a little bit about the newsletter relaunch on June 7th next week?
Yep. Due to the move, I pushed the cyberspace move of this newsletter to June 7th, and we've already got a report lined up from a guest contributor. So we'll be putting this out. I am on Ghost now instead of Substack. It's much better. I don't think people who get charged as subscribers are going to think they're being scammed. There were a few who were having their Stripe, the charge coming from Stripe.com, which is the payment processing service that is used. It didn't appear that it was our newsletter. It looked like something else, suggesting that it could be some spam service or someone had got your credit card information and you didn't give them permission. So people were reporting fraud, which resulted in penalties being assessed to us. So we think we're beyond that because we're no longer at Substack, and we're developing our site, and it's going to have its own space, this newsletter. And we moved everyone over. If you were subscribed, you don't have to do anything. But once we're up, we'll be pushing for new subscribers and hoping to convince people who are free subscribers to upgrade and give us a little bit per month to be paid subscribers, and hopefully have more regular reports going out during the week. Try to have about 2 to 3 posts per week with some excellent and necessary coverage of what's going on with whistleblowers. Anthony had asked if there were problems with Substack. We covered it extensively a couple of weeks ago, but the choice to move was owed to the fact that we became upset with Substack management and how they were taking care of us. They no longer really seemed to value having us on the platform, and they made some changes specific to our newsletter when we signed up. And then as we asked them to continue to allow us the flexibility to bring in money at multiple levels, they told us we could not have those multiple levels anymore, and we needed to find another platform. So here at Ghost and the way that we're going to have it set up, I'll be able to have people donate in many different ways without the constrictions of Substack, where people could only give at a monthly rate or an annual rate. Now I have a monthly and an annual rate, but there'll also be a way for people to donate when they read a post that they like. If they don't want to be monthly subscribers, they could just basically tip for it, and that's going to enable us to fund more journalism through this newsletter. I think this is going to be good. Yeah, I mean, in general, my dig against Substack is that they're just out to monetize personalities. And I think that's something that David Sirota and the people at Daily Poster recognized because they left the platform. That's what some other people have recognized as they've made choices to leave. I'm not really making a political critique here. I'm making a business critique, because what goes on with a platform like Substack is they want to make the most money. And a newsletter that's taking longer to grow like ours is not a great investment proposition for Substack. So what Substack wants are people who have falling outs with their news media company and then can just come over and bring their following to them, and they could instantly rake in money from the fact that they are popular individuals. And that's not to say that all those people who are popular don't deserve to make money off of what they're doing, but it's to say that I don't really think Substack is in the business of building independent journalism. And so now we're going to be in our own space, and we'll be able to focus and build up our newsletter, and it'll be an extension of the work that is happening at Shadowproof, where if Brian wants to come back in, we can just remind you all that we have Marvel Cook Fellowship news reports and essays and writings along the lines of issues involving prisons and the abolition of police, etc., and more broadly criminal justice issues. Those are reports that we continue to put up, and so I can't say that I wish Substack the best, because I left with a bad taste in my mouth. But what I will say is that we don't have to worry about it anymore. And I would caution people, anyone who's there thinking they're going to build their newsletter at Substack, that they understand that this is a company that's constantly seeking venture capital to raise tens of millions of dollars in order to boost their company. And so I don't think they're interested in journalism. I think they're interested in writing, and there's a difference. And I don't know that it's necessary to go into it on this show, but people should recognize that we do journalism. Then there are other people online that do writing. And if people want to read writing, that's fine. There's platforms like Medium and then Substack that are really good places if you want to do writing. If you want to do things like, 5 different ways to do Zen and become in touch with your inner self, if that's what people want to read, that's fine. But that's not what we do. That's not journalism. That's writing. And that's what Substack wants to do. It's not controversial. It doesn't affect anyone. It doesn't impact anything. It doesn't challenge the powerful. And so they're never going to acknowledge or reward a newsletter like ours. They're not going to reward a newsletter like David Sirota's Daily Poster. those things challenge centers of power. And so we have to do this on our own without support from organizations that do have money and are entrenched in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also if you're somebody who has a Substack or is considering starting one, it's also worth pointing out that, and I think that you said this in so many words, Kevin, but they take more of your money in fees, and they have less features and a lot less, I guess, customer service or anything like that. It's kind of a swindle in that regard. They take a bigger cut than Ghost does, and Ghost allows us a huge amount more flexibility and tools, and seem actually more invested in the experience on our end than Substack, which seems to literally just be a credit card machine with a text on top of it. I think that pretty much does it.
It's 10%.
Yeah, that's a lot of money.
They take 10%. Substack.
Yeah.
Ghost takes 0. Ghost lets you subscribe annually to use the platform. We pay a one-time cost, and then they never take any more money. And so that is the best way to do it. And we're also going to use a service that helps us connect with our members. I've got some good people working on it. It's this service called Outpost that adds value to your site and your ability to actually connect with your subscribers so that they get the most out of being subscribers of your newsletter. It's something that Substack isn't even contemplating how they would do this. It's not even part, it's not even fair to say that like they don't offer it. It's the fact that like this isn't even anything they would want to try, because they're so lazy over there and they just want to make as much money as possible by offering the least amount of services. Yeah,
they're basically just charging rent on publications. They're like landlords for independent journalists. They're just like a middleman who is just charging you money for literally, like, the technology couldn't be worse or more simplistic than what they offer. So, well, we can start another show where we exclusively bash Substack. We'll start that next. That'll be a separate show from this one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'd say I do a weekly show where we talked about Substack every week and covered the worst of it. But it would just seem like I had a grudge and couldn't let go of how I'm really over it. Like, I can't wait to show you what this site is going to be like on June 7th, because it's going to be a really awesome space.
Yeah, it's cool.
I'm excited to present it to people, and I'm excited by what we're going to be able to do. It's going to renew my energy as a journalist, and I will leave that there. We seem to be ending with an all right internet connection. I know it's been bumpy throughout, but thank you all for staying tuned in, and I'll let Brian sign off with anything he wants you to know about Shadowproof before we go.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin, for all of the work today. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We've got some great stories coming up at Shadowproof. I've got a bunch of really good drafts on my desk on everything from jailhouse lawyering to the international abolitionist movement. A lot of great stories. We have some incarcerated writers we'll be publishing very soon, drafts on that I'm getting on the experience of sort of this latter half of the pandemic in jails and prisons, as the pandemic, quote unquote, winds down, what is actually happening on the inside. Just a lot of great stories. We have somebody else writing about, who is incarcerated, writing about the issues around parole in Georgia. So a lot of good stuff coming. I'm very excited to share with all of you. If you want to help us fund that reporting, Kevin's reporting, everything, you can go to shadowproof.com/donate and give there. You can sign up for Kevin's newsletter, especially once it relaunches next week. That would be a great time. And we'll use that money to pay our writers. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Keep an eye on Shadowproof on our social media, and we will talk to you next week. Take care.